Hi everyone, my name is Chad Holbron, and I'll be presenting the first half of Chapter 7, Enhancing Communication Skills in Groups, from verbal dynamics in small groups through territoriality. This chapter is all about communication itself. In this presentation, I'll be outlining verbal dynamics in small groups, listening, the importance of nonverbal communication in groups, and the application of nonverbal communication research to groups. Verbal dynamics in small groups. Words are tools that help people make sense of the world and share that sense with others. As we learned in Chapter 6, when group members feel a need to protect themselves, they shift their attention, which can create barriers to effective group process. The three barriers are bypassing, honest, and fact inference confusion. Now, bypassing happens when two people assign different meanings to the same word, and that can be avoided by just using specific language and being aware of multiple interpretations of what we say. And honest is a statement that is simple, but it has untrue generalizations, and that can be avoided by not overgeneralizing and by remembering that individuals are unique. Fact inference occurs when people respond to something as if they actually observed it, when in reality they have only drawn a conclusion. And we can avoid that by having a clear analysis and learn the difference between fact and inference, and also by communicating the differences clearly. Okay, listening. Listening is an active process through which people select, attend, understand, and remember. So in the next few slides, we'll be discussing listening styles, obstacles to effective listening, and a guide to active listening. Now, there's different types of listening styles, and they are people-oriented listeners, action-oriented listeners, content-oriented listeners, and time-oriented listeners. Now, people-oriented listeners, those are the people who are most comfortable listening to other people's feelings and emotions. And action-oriented is people who prefer information that is well organized, brief, and free of any errors. And content-oriented, they basically like their information in rich content. And time-oriented listeners, they just prefer a brief message. Now, continuing with listening, there's also obstacles to effective listening. And the first obstacle is prejudging the communicator or the communication, and the second is rehearsing the response. Now, we don't want to prejudge others on the basis of culture, ethnicity, or race, and we definitely don't want to rehearse a response. It's the tendency that people have to rehearse a response in their minds to what they will say when the other person stops speaking. The thought-speech differential is better used to attend fully to what the speaker is saying and not saying. A guide to active listening. So first we want to stop, we want to look, listen, ask appropriate questions, paraphrase content, and we also want to paraphrase feelings. So when I mentioned stop, you basically want to put all your thoughts aside and you want to be there mentally to make a conscious and mindful effort to listen and to take time to listen. And you don't want to rush the speaker. You want to be patient so you can be open-minded. And then you want to look for clues that will help you identify how the other person is feeling. And you also want to listen for what the other person is telling you. You want to match their verbal cue with nonverbal cues to decipher content and emotion. And you also want to ask appropriate questions. So this will actually help you to obtain additional information, find out how someone feels, to get clarification of a word or phrase, or just to verify the conclusion about the other person's meaning or feeling. And paraphrase content is to basically restate in your own words what you think the other person is saying. And that brings us to the importance of nonverbal communication in groups. Now, nonverbal communication is behavior that does not rely on written or spoken language or words. It includes body posture and movement, eye contact, facial expressions, seating arrangements, spatial relationships, personal appearance, use of time, and tone of voice. So the importance of nonverbal communication in groups is more time is spent communicating nonverbally than it is verbally. And emotions and feelings are typically expressed nonverbally than they are verbally. And nonverbal messages are usually more believable than verbal messages. Applications of nonverbal communication research to groups. So the next few slides are going to cover posture, movement, and gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, vocal cues, personal space, and territoriality. Now we begin with posture, movement, and gestures, and that involves emblems, illustrators, effect display, regulators, and adapters. Now, emblems are movements and gestures that replace spoken language. For example, group members shaking their heads to communicate a no response or a yes response. And illustrators would be nonverbal behaviors that add meaning to accompany verbal communication. So, for example, let's say a group member holds their hands 3 feet apart while saying, "We need about a yard of fabric." And affect display is basically an expression of feeling. So, for example, that would be frowning, smiling, grimacing, smirking. And regulators are nonverbal behavior that control the flow of communication within the group. So, for example, that would be eye contact, raising a hand or finger to signal someone that you would like to speak. And lastly, adapters. Those are nonverbal acts that satisfy personal needs and help group members adapt to their environment. For example, searching, yawning, and adjusting glasses. Eye contact. So there's different kinds of eye contact. The first is cognitive, the next one is monitoring, followed by regulatory, and lastly, expressive. Now, eye contact happens in small groups, and it serves all these functions listed here. So cognitive indicates thought process, monitoring indicates how we seek feedback from others when communicating with them. And regulatory is regulating a back and forth flow of communication to establish that the communication channel is either opened or closed. And expressive provides information about feelings, emotions, and attitudes. Facial expressions. Facial expressions are significant because of close proximity of communicators in small groups. Now, the face can produce thousands of facial expressions which are identifiable. For example, if someone is happy, then you generally tend to focus on their eyes, and there's going to be a smile along with raised cheeks. Now, let's say if someone is angry, then you're going to see lowered eyebrows and a intense stare. Vocal cues. Vocal cues are also referred to as paralanguage. So vocal cues involve the pitch, the rate, the volume, and the quality of your voice to determine how important message or the meaning of the message is. And lastly, we come to personal space and territoriality. So personal space we see a lot of in Western cultures. So as you can see in the picture for personal space, intimate space is 0 to 1.5 feet. Personal space is 1.5 to 4 feet. Social space is 4 feet to 12 feet. And public space is 12 feet and beyond. And then territoriality is generally a term that people use when they're studying animals. But humans also exhibit this trait. It's a way for members of a group to signify they are claiming territory by placing objects in, from, and around themselves. So, next time you're at a meeting, take a look around the table and notice how posture and gesture change if space is invaded. So that concludes my presentation.